Galloway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, Robert, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. Thank you for the kind invitation to be here this evening and the warmth of the welcome, and a big thanks to those who came to confront any far-right elements that might have turned up. You may well be asking why I have driven hundreds of miles and hundreds of miles back in foul weather on the first day of the general election campaign to help launch somebody else's election campaign. Certainly my wife is asking that question, and some of my comrades in Bradford were asking that question, so let me explain. Firstly, because I was forced to break the commitment to speak here last time. I'm still limping a bit, but I'm very much better now, and the man who assaulted me whilst wearing an Israeli army uniform, having that morning said that he wished he could cut my throat, is currently serving a lengthy prison sentence, so I think I'm doing better than him, at least I hope so. So it's first of all out of a need to keep commitments. And just for the avoidance of doubt, if there is a copper in the room that may or may not join in the singing at the end, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Communist Party. But I didn't disagree with a single word that Rob Griffiths said in his opening address. But I do believe in personal loyalty. More than 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago, I could have been a member of Parliament here in South Wales, in the Rhondda. I was the Transport and General Workers Union candidate to be the Labour Member of Parliament, or Labour candidate, in the by-election which took place here. I came then, as I come now, a bearded Scotsman in the tradition of Keir Hardie. I did quite well with the assistance of Robert Griffiths, who came on the first day that I arrived here, though I was obviously not as well known then as I became, and gave me every support, bringing me to trade union meetings and other events, introducing me to people as I sought to persuade them that really the South Wales Valley needed a Scotsman of the firebrand contingent to set politics alight here in the valleys. We managed to get more nominations than all of the other candidates put together. And at the shortlisting meeting, all of the other candidates combined with each other to keep me off the shortlist, in the South Wales Labour Party tradition. The then Welsh Secretary of the Union, George Wright, he was well named, George Wright, even he had to muster some thunder about this grotesque, undemocratic chicanery, and the then leadership of the union were just getting ready to make an official and even legal complaint about this when we were overcome by the onrush of the general election in 1983. I have spent almost 30 years in Parliament since, so I guess you could say, in one sense, I didn't lose anything. But you certainly could say that the man that got the gig and the man that followed him were both exactly the kind of Labour Member of Parliament that Rob Griffiths was describing. Either care less of the radical traditions of this area, or worse, determined to betray them and be voices for privatisation, inequality, and even war, about which more later. But I did come away from my time in the Ronda with two things of importance to me. The first is my now lifelong friendship with Rob Griffiths, which brings me here to help launch his election campaign. And the second is my honorary membership of the National Union of Mine Workers South Wales Area Mardy Lodge, which is one of my proudest possessions. A lodge presumably now disbanded, a pit certainly now closed, a coal field butchered and destroyed in the period of the Thatcher government. Sometimes in the audiences I now address, I have to explain what Thatcher was, who Thatcher was. I know that I don't have to do that here. But we are still, as a country, suffering the results of the scarring, of the division that the Thatcher era produced. There is no need to, if you'll forgive the pun, labour that point here. But last night in London, I was speaking at a memorial event to mark the first anniversary of the demise of the late and great Tony Benn. And I was describing for an audience, almost none of whom were born at the time, how the path which led to Thatcher and the seismic defeat had been paved by the mistakes of the Labour government which had preceded it, and how Mr. Benn, foremost amongst all others, had warned throughout the 1974 to 79 period that there was no good in being in office if you were not in power, and there was no good in having power if you didn't use it to fundamentally change Britain in the interests of working people and their families. And how he was exiled first from the industry portfolio to the energy portfolio, and ultimately out of the front bench, out of frontline Labour leadership altogether. And I said last night, if we had followed Tony Benn, maybe Thatcher might never have happened. If Thatcher had happened, it may be that Mr. Benn would have lost the 1983 election with his socialist transformative programme. But then we lost it anyway. Maybe Mr. Benn would have lost the 1987 general election, but then we lost it anyway. Maybe Mr. Benn would have lost the 1992 general election, but we lost it anyway. But in those 15 years, if we had had the clarity, eloquence, charisma of Tony Benn at the front of the Labour Party, I tell you what, we would have been in with a real chance in 1997 of really changing Britain. And it led me on last night to another anecdote that is worth repeating. In that period, few of you are old enough to remember it, John Haylett and I certainly do, we were told every day, all day, in all media, that Tony Benn was the most hated man in Britain. That he was bad. if not actually mad. Every day, one or other of the papers of record that are called regularly in the Times and the Sunday Times, cod psychologists were rolled out to explain that Mr. Benn was clearly, clinically mad. Something to do with the amount of tea that he drank. They even found some long-lost ancestor from the 18th century who allegedly was mad and said that it was a genetic thing. But as I was at Mr. Benn's right hand, travelling all over Britain, speaking at mass rallies, I knew actually Mr. Benn was quite popular. And I told the story of what happened the morning after a meeting that we did at the St. George's Hall in Liverpool, which was packed with thousands of people. And as we were driving on to the next engagement, Hugh Wyper, John, the late Secretary General of the Transport and General Workers Union in Scotland, Hugh Wyper, me and Tony Benn, we stopped in a motorway services. Tony had tea, that tea again, and toast, but he never drank it, and he never ate it, because as soon as the people dining there saw that he was there, they all came over. There were no mobile phones in those days, so it wasn't a quick selfie. It was a long autograph, and Mr. Benn used to drive me mad. He couldn't just write his name. He had to ask their name, their wife's name, their children's name, and write a long message. Every one took minutes. And then the staff, the chefs, the waitresses, all started coming out from the kitchen, the porters, the chefs in their tall hats. And then I saw that people were abandoning their cars in the forecourt of the petrol station, and they were coming in. So tumultuous did the occasion become that Mr. Benn got on a chair. I was holding his legs on a chair, and he addressed this crowd. This, the most hated man in Britain, was addressing virtually everyone in a motorway service station as only he could, offering this vision, this narrative as they call it nowadays, this vision of what Britain could be. And as I listened to Ed Miliband on the radio, as I drove here today, I couldn't help compare and contrast. That vision, that greatness of Tony Benn on that chair in that service station with what Labour has become. Now there's a moral in that story. You see, if we believed what the media tell us about our leaders, about our activists, about our campaigners, well, as Malcolm X put it, if you listen to the media, you'll end up loving the oppressor and hating the oppressed. And it's easier now than it was then. You used to have to look for a Morning Star seller or a shop that took the paper to find an alternative narrative, an alternative analysis of what's happening. But now, at the touch of a phone or a computer button, you can read the Morning Star online. If you do, make sure you make a donation in lieu of buying the paper. You can watch RT, Russia Today. You can watch other television stations. You can search YouTube. You can find any speaker, any version of events if you search for them. And you must. So, I believe paradoxically, although our political class is so poor, so dire, that there are more people in Britain today either already in possession of or looking for another way, a different way of running our country, and another way our country can be in the world. And so, far from feeling hopeless, I am filled with hope for the future. Of course I want Ed Miliband to defeat David Cameron. That's not saying much. But if I'm in the next Parliament, as I very much hope that I will be, if Ed Miliband is looking for a single vote for his majority, I'm ready to be that vote. But I have a price. And my price is a return to real Labour values and real Labour policies. And so, what would they look like? Well, I was on BBC Any Questions on Radio 4 on Friday night. You can find it on the iPlayer or on YouTube. I was on alongside, literally alongside, unfortunately, the Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, one Rachel Reeves. The one that said on Question Time that she was going to be tougher on claimants than the Conservative government has been tougher on the poor than Ian Duncan Smith. That was her boast. She didn't make many pledges, but this she pledged, sitting right next to me, in a discussion about the so-called 2% of GDP being spent on defence. She pledged, thrice she pledged, we will keep Trident, we will renew Britain's nuclear defences. This after crocodile tears, an ocean of crocodile tears, about the plight of the poor and the old and the sick and the lame. But she was going to do nothing for them. She could promise them nothing. Nothing at all. But she could promise the generals, those that support Trident, and that's not all of them, £100 billion worth of spending on nuclear weapons. Which, as Rob Griffiths said, he made only one part of the equation. Let me make the other part. Of course, it's unconscionable that we would launch a nuclear weapon against innocent civilians and murder hundreds of thousands, probably millions of them. But there's another side of that coin. That's not the only reason why we can never use the Trident nuclear missiles. The other reason is that as soon as we fired them, whoever we were firing them at would fire their nuclear weapons at us, and we would no longer exist. It would be a national act of suicide. Suicide. You couldn't fire a nuclear weapon at somebody that didn't have nuclear weapons. So if you fired them at somebody that did, you would no longer exist. Even the people that gave the order to fire them would no longer exist. Even if they were in a bunker miles below the earth, life above them would cease to exist. And yet, in her defense of nuclear weapons on Friday night, Rachel Reeves said that we need them. Why? Because Russia is becoming an aggressor again. Of course, the time involved in the cut and thrust of any questions doesn't allow much examination of that claim. But if ever a claim was the precise opposite of the truth, it's that claim. Russia's not aggressing against us. We are aggressing against Russia. We are threatening Russia, not Russia threatening us. There are no Russian military advisors and trainers being sent to the Republic of Ireland. Russia's not formed a military alliance and moved its tanks and its rockets up to our border. But we have done exactly that to Russia. They keep saying how democratic they are. It doesn't seem to occur to them that the president of Russia is one of the most elected politicians on the earth. It doesn't seem to occur to them that the only reason there's a war in the Ukraine now is because we, with our money, backed the far-right nationalists, even fascists, in the Ukraine to overthrow the elected government in Kiev. It's our intention to move our tanks closer and closer to the Russian border in Georgia and the Caucasus and in the Ukraine that is the cause of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. She said that Russia had sent forces to Ukraine. That's a flat lie. If Russia had sent forces to the Ukraine, it would have been conquered in an afternoon and there would be now no war in the Ukraine. But they didn't. The people in eastern Ukraine are defending their rights as Russian-speaking people to their own way of life. And they have every right to do so. But it shows you how the truth can be twisted so easily by these people. They themselves must know that it's a lie. The alternative being that they're idiots, which, come to think of it, might actually in some cases be the truth. But by repeating a lie often enough, it has the same weight as the truth. I recently, again you can see this on YouTube, debated with a general of the NATO command who had just days before retired from British military service. Now he's out everywhere proselytizing for more war preparation against Russia. He said in the debate at Hay-on-Wye, not that far from Wales, he said, I'm quoting directly now, British mothers will have to get used to the fact that their sons may have to give their life's blood to defend Latvia. I said, do they know yet? To defend Latvia? First of all, Latvia is not threatened by anyone. Secondly, when did we decide that our front line was Latvia? I was never consulted. Parliament was never consulted. You were never consulted. But this kind of war psychosis is on the march again in Britain. We very nearly went to war with Syria just a couple of summers ago. But for 13 votes in Parliament, we would have been at war already, and certainly until now, with Syria, behind them Iran, behind them Russia. Could have been a world war, averted by 13 votes. Imagine. And of course, in the last decade, 12 years, we have been at war again and again and again. We have no money to keep our old age pensioners warm in the winter time, but we have money to burn, setting fire to other people's countries, one after the other, year after year. We have a political class which cannot accept that Britain is not an imperial power. It's an imperial pretender. It's doing what Mussolini used to do, going around the world, threatening people with somebody else's army. It has no military power, meaningfully, of itself, not that it can use, and thus excluding its nuclear weapons. But it does have the ability to be the fig leaf covering the ugliness of those who do have that military power. So we need an alternative vision. a vision of a different Britain in the world. And we need a set of different priorities for Britain. The gap between rich and poor in Britain today is wider than it was when Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. That's official. Imagine. In 2015, the gap grows ever wider. And in London, some parts of it, the gap within one city is so evident. It's one of the reasons why I hate this nationalist talk about London. There are more poor people living within a 7-mile radius of the House of Commons than there are anywhere else in the country. Millions of them. But of course, in the square mile, the city, and some other privileged parts, the asset wealth, the agglomeration of prosperity by some has transformed London into a tale of two cities, rich and poor in the same city, as wide a gap as there was, wider, in fact, than when Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. And of course, as someone wrote in the Guardian, I think today, Britain now has 3 polities, in fact. It has the Scottish dimension, which is ever more vibrantly social democratic and doesn't want to be part of a Tory-dominated Britain. We have the very much more prosperous parts of London and the southeast, and we have what they call post-industrial Britain. That's you and that's me. In Bradford, in Merthyr Tydfil, we are described insultingly as post-industrial Britain. What does that mean in real terms? Rob will know the figures here, of course, far better than me. But I tell you what it means in Bradford. It means 50% of the young people on the dole. 50%. It means schools that are the second worst in England. It means public services which are virtually non-existent in many parts of the constituency. It means the largest number of children living in poverty of any ward, Little Horton ward in Bradford, with the largest number of children living in poverty of any ward in the entire country. It means the constant insecurity, even fear about the future. Now, as it happens, neither Merthyr nor Bradford are post-industrial. There is new industrial realities in both places, to be sure. But as one cannot do, as was proposed here in the 30s, close Bradford down, close Merthyr down, ship the people to Canada. I mean, Australia might have been a bit warmer, but to ship the people to Canada is, of course, no longer an option. So I don't know if they've got plans for us, but they bloody well better. And it's our job, Rob, you and me, hopefully together in the new House of Commons, it's our job to make sure that we do. Because if this capitalist system cannot provide a future for the people, well, we better get a new system. After all, the economy is supposed to work for humankind, not humankind working for capitalism. If it cannot provide jobs, if it cannot provide security, if it cannot provide a life worth living, then why should we have it? Why shouldn't we reach out for that vision that Mr. Benn so brilliantly articulated in the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and until actually the moment of his death, as is represented by Rob Griffith's candidature in this election, as is represented by me and my fellows in Bradford and elsewhere in the forthcoming general election. Another world is possible. It better be, because this way is the road to ruin. Thanks very much indeed for listening to me tonight.